Tibet is the source of all major rivers that flow into South and Southeast Asia. Tonight we're going to discuss the health of those rivers, the impact of mining and dam building in Tibet on those rivers. My guest tonight is Michael Buckley. He is an award-winning Canadian journalist, filmmaker, and author. He's traveled extensively in Tibet since 1985, is the author of the first English-language guidebook on Tibet, Lonely Planet's Tibet Guide. He's the author of 10 other books on Asia and the Himalayas. Welcome, Michael. Thank you.
Good evening. No.
Michael, can you start off by telling us what are the major activities going on inside Tibet that is causing the environmental degradation and especially on the rivers inside Tibet?
Well, what's been happening lately, and ever since the railway reached Lhasa in 2006, is an acceleration of Chinese plans to develop the West. There's a big program called Develop the West, and part of that development is it's not a benefit to the locals. It's in two phases, basically. It's damming and mining, and those two go together. And previously the dams have been on the lower edges of the Tibetan plateau. Now they're starting to move up onto the plateau because China builds in cascades. So dam cascades, they build 3, 4, and then they get the power from that, and then they start building more upstream. So that's what's happening with the dams. And then the mining, of course, is accelerated because the train is a very economical way to exploit the mineral resources and carry it back into China. And of course, none of this benefits Tibetans at all. It's all exported. Tibet has huge reserves of lithium, copper, all kinds of minerals, probably worth, the estimate by the Chinese is 125 billion US dollars, but the real value could be 900 billion, probably more. So these things are happening ever since the railway really accelerated this system. It's been going on for a long time, but now we have acceleration.
I see. So is there a system of consultation with the local communities inside Tibet as to where mining can occur, where dams can be started?
The system of consultation consists of firing guns at Tibetans. That's the system of consultation. There is no involvement at local level, any local level of Tibetans. They're just treated as spectators.
I see.
So they're in their own land. I mean, there's one Tibetan who visited Tibet once put it down in the book. He said that we have become a land of beggars. That's what we are. You know, we used to own the land, we used to manage the land, we did whatever. Now we're just beggars, mute spectators.
You first went to Tibet in 1985, and then you've traveled there in the early 90s. What do you see? Do you see any clear changes in the environment yourself? I mean, just by traveling in the condition of the rivers?
Most certainly. It's very hard to detect changes in rivers because you'd have to follow the rivers from the source all the way down, which is a very difficult thing to do because they're hidden down really deep gorges. For example, the Salween and Mekong. But I can give you an example. Yes, I bicycled across Tibet back in '86, and we passed through Yangtze, the sacred lake of Yangtze. And then I passed this lake numerous times over the last 20 years, and each time it gets worse and worse, what's happening to that lake. I mean, first of all, you had these Austrian turbines that came in, the Chinese building this pumping station for no particular reason that we can work out, which is changing the whole nature of the lake. And this is a highly sacred lake. This is one of the top 4 sacred lakes in Tibet.
I see.
And Tibetans have this belief that if something is disturbed with this lake, then the whole Tibetan culture and a race is at stake. It's a little bit, that's the legend. And you can see that, I couldn't tell you if the lake is changing color, but certainly there seems to be no particular reason for this pumping storage station and for generating power to Lhasa. So that's one example. The rivers themselves, well, I mean, things are changing on the rivers. There's no doubt about that. When you put in 5 huge dams on the Mekong, that's going to change the whole ecosystem. I mean, the last dam that opened on the Mekong, Noazadu, 5.8 gigawatts. It's the size of 5 nuclear reactors. You can't put in a dam that size and not expect it to affect what's happening on that river. It has a huge impact.
Now, let's discuss, for instance, coming out of Tibet are the Brahmaputra, the Salween, the Mekong, the Indus, the Sutlej, Irrawaddy, and the Yellow and Yangtze rivers that flow into China. What is the impact of dam building, for instance, on the rivers and on the downstream countries?
Well, the impact depends on how many dams are in the upper reaches, but already on the lower reaches, you've got enormous impact coming up on the Mekong. The Salween less, because what happened on the Salween was that the Chinese NGOs, environmental groups, managed to block the building of 13 mega dams a few years back, and they thought they had won a victory. But now, under China's new 10-year plan, there's been a revival of 5 of those dams. They're mega dams, and actually work has started on 2 of them, which means that that has not been a victory in stopping those dams being built on the Salween. So what's happening on the Indus is rather peculiar, because recently we came across some reports that there's consideration to divert the water from the Indus to the north. And this is something else that goes hand in hand with dams, is diversion. Because once you get the dams up, you can also divert water. And there are plans that we have come across on Chinese websites to divert the Brahmaputra, the Salween, the Mekong, and the Indus, all going north. And why are they going north, northwest? Because of mining. There's fracking coming up in China. China is one of the largest, it probably has the largest deposits of shale gas and shale oil in the world. And a lot of those deposits are in either Qinghai or Xinjiang. And you need enormous quantities of water to process those.
So what you're saying that there's a direct correlation between the dam building and the mines that are cropping up all over Tibet?
Well, they work hand in hand. They work together. So in order to, you need the dams to power up the mines. They need power. And then dams, I mean, mining also needs lots of water, tons of water. If you want to process copper, if you want to process coal, you need enormous quantities of water. And what's even more worrisome now is that China is looking at exploiting oil sands, like as in tar sands. And for that, you need mega amounts of water. For example, 1 barrel of oil will need 3 barrels of water. And then also, mining contributes to the export of energy from dams, because what's happened now is that they have UHV lines that run from dams in Tibet all the way to the east coast, 2,000 or 3,000 kilometers, and they're using a technology of UHV, ultra high voltage, which uses copper. Copper is the main ingredient in those lines. And of course, copper comes from Tibet, because Tibet has the largest deposits of copper in the whole of China, the whole of the PRC. And so you need one to get the other, and they work in tandem.
I see. So what are some of the possible direct results of damming upriver in Tibet on, for instance, Bangladesh, India, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, etc.?
Huge impact. We may not have seen, we have seen a lot on the Mekong. A lot of people think that dams are just involving water. It's a lot more than water. It's a very complex situation. The river, you can't even talk about individual rivers. There's tributaries, there's all kinds of things connected. But I would talk about a few things like silt. For example, the dam builders hate silt because it clogs up the turbines, but silt is the lifeline for agriculture. You need silt because silt is like a cocktail of potassium, nitrogen, calcium, all kinds of chemicals and minerals that the agriculture needs. And if you don't get that silt, you're going to have to replace it with artificial fertilizer, which is usually in the form of nitrogen. And nitrogen is very bad for the environment, usually, because it produces nitrous oxide, which is something like 300 times more powerful than greenhouse gases.
So the dams are actually stopping the silt from flowing downstream.
Yes, they will block probably up to 90% of the silt. Probably even more. And when you get too much silt, the dam itself cannot operate because it becomes so clogged up that the turbines don't work.
I see.
So they have to figure out a way of unblocking the silt. But that silt is not, tons and tons of silt would come through on that river if it was not for the dam. And here's another problem. If that silt does not come through, it is not going down to the deltas, and the deltas are sinking because they're not getting the same volume of silt. And if the deltas start sinking, then the sea level rise will be more pronounced, and then you get salt intrusion into the crop. So, when you talk about rice is very water intensive. You need a lot of things for rice. You need tons and tons of water, but you also need silt, and you have to make sure that you don't get saltwater intrusion coming from the coast, because that'll ruin your crops.
I see.
But the other thing that rivers bring, and this goes together with the silt, is fish. And a place like Cambodia, something like 70–80% of their protein comes from fish.
Bangladesh.
Where do the fish come from? Bangladesh was also heavily dependent on protein from fish. And a lot of fishing going on in Bangladesh. So those two nations in particular.
I see.
There's some fish farming that goes on in Vietnam. It's an alternative. You can produce the fish But that's not as easily done as just catching fish from the river.
I see.
It requires a lot more investment. But that's an alternative is fish farming. But you can only go so far with fish farming. It's much better to use the wild fish from the rivers. And in the case of Cambodia, the fish catch is way down, not Lake Tonle Sap.
I see.
And Lake Tonle Sap is the backup system for the Mekong. It depends on annual flooding from the Mekong. If you don't get the annual flooding, you won't get the fish.
So, Michael, I just want to get back to your point about the deltas. How extensively are we talking about? How many deltas in Asia, and the areas that we're discussing that are impacted by river degradation? About how many people are we talking about in Asia?
You're looking at the world's biggest deltas. The biggest deltas in the world, the Ganges-Brahmaputra is by far the biggest delta in the world, and it's the breadbasket for Bangladesh, India. Then you're talking about the Irrawaddy Delta for Burma, the main sort of rice basket for Burma. Then you have the Mekong Delta, Vietnam, Cambodia, huge provider of food for those two countries. And you've also got the Indus Delta, Pakistan. And you've got the Yangtze Delta and also the Yellow River Delta in China. So you've got a lot of deltas there. And most of these ones are in trouble. All of those deltas are in trouble.
I see.
The one that's thriving most would be the one in Vietnam because they put a lot of energy into making it survive in Vietnam. But a place like the Indus Delta is dying. The Indus Delta in Pakistan, a lot of people have moved away from the Indus Delta because, number one, it's sinking. And number two, the mangrove protection that used to be there is gone. And they got a lot of saltwater intrusion happening there. And the same kind of fate could happen to the Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta.
So we're talking about possibly an impact on roughly 500,000 people or 1 billion people or so.
If you look at, I would calculate overall the rivers from Tibet would be, in one way or another, are connected to the lives of 1 billion, possibly 2 billion people. The deltas themselves, they're very, very highly populated. Ganges-Brahmaputra is extremely highly populated. And I couldn't give you exact figures, but for example, the Mekong River is supposed to support maybe 60 million people along its banks, not counting the delta. So there's a lot, we're talking about the two most populous nations on Earth, China and India. And in the middle, between them or around them are these rivers and the deltas. And, the populations of Bangladesh. Bangladesh has a huge population. It's got 180 million people, and the same for Pakistan, another huge population. So any impact of the rivers is a major impact.
So I'd like to turn to the two rivers that flow out of Tibet into China, the Yellow and the Yangtze rivers. Can you tell us a little bit about the condition of those two river systems? And the impact of dam building on those rivers?
Well, those two rivers, as far as I'm concerned, are dead rivers. They rarely reach the sea these days. They haven't for some time, not for the last 10 years. And there's so much industry along the banks of the Yangtze and so much water diversion, both water diversion and industry, so heavily polluted that apparently there are stretches of the Yellow or the Yangtze that are not suitable for irrigation for crops. And when you get to that stage, when you can't even use the river for agriculture, you're in deep trouble. And recently there's been a report from Greenpeace about huge coal mining concerns in Inner Mongolia, which belongs to China, and showing these massive coal ventures along the banks of the Yellow to the point where the river is totally destroyed. You can't have a situation where you have so many coal mining ventures along the banks and not expected to affect the river. And this coal mining that's happening in both inner and outer Mongolia is rather alarming because of the scale of what's happening there. It's huge scale.
I see.
So these rivers are polluted, diverted, they're dead.
I see. So the possible outcome of mining and dam building in Tibet on the river systems of Asia, essentially almost all of them, do you think China is aware of the negative impact of the mining and damming in Tibet on those rivers? And if so, is China engaging in any kind of mitigation of what's happening, and are river agreements a possibility between nations to work out some kind of solutions?
If China actually has a huge number of neighbors, I think it's 14 on its borders, and out of those 14, I think it has ongoing disputes with 12 of them. We're not counting the South China Sea, we're counting the land borders. So it gives you an idea, China is not renowned for dialogue. That's one thing Beijing is not very famous for. So I don't think they basically just disregard all the downstream countries. The only person that could really take them on, I guess, is India. And India has made no headway in water sharing agreements, even in Beijing, they've not made any headway. So Beijing has no water sharing agreements with any country on its borders, not a single one. India has an agreement with Pakistan. Bangladesh has an agreement with India. They have, to avoid warfare, they have agreements on the water sharing. Pakistan took the Indus and India took the Sutlej River to avoid disputes. But China has no such thing, and furthermore, China claims, and it said this openly, that it owns the high ground and it has sovereignty and it does not care what happens downstream. It said as much, that the water belongs to it in the upstream reaches, and it does not care what happens when the water leaves the borders of China, or in this case, Tibet.
Yeah. Michael, finally, do you see any hope for the rivers and countries downstream from Tibet?
Yes, I see hope because, 50 years ago, this was not a problem. These were not problems. There was no problem with the rivers. There was no dams. There was no problem with the mining. So what is the difference is that a lot of these projects can be canceled at the stroke of a pen. It just takes one person to say, okay, we're going to cancel that dam project. So I think what has to happen is you need a change of attitude amongst the Chinese overseers of Tibet, or actually within China itself, to have some more respect for nature. And they just don't have a moral system in place where they have a respect for nature. It's the opposite. Mao Zedong's dictum was that man must conquer nature. That was and it's still around, that same process. So you don't have to tell Tibetans to do this. They have a belief system that venerates nature. They go on pilgrimage to sacred peaks and lakes. The attitude change has to come from within China to solve this problem.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Michael. Thank you for speaking with us.
Thank you.